Welcome. Join me again to thank and congratulate pianist and conductor Joseph Tabrizi, who did a great job today, and he's also going to do some other things later on. Joe, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Rothstein. I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and on behalf of myself and Alan Price and everyone from the library and the foundation team, we're thrilled you're here on this beautiful day, and you have a real treat in store for you. Before I talk about what these two great gentlemen, I just want to briefly thank some of our sponsors and a few other things. First, the Kennedy Library Forum is only possible because of the great support from a number of friends, including Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, Gourmet Catering, and our media sponsors, The Globe, Xfinity, and BUR. We're also thrilled for those of you watching online today. Welcome for those watching online. After the forum, Todd has agreed to sign copies of his book, which you can get from the bookstore if you don't have one already. I hope when you leave, you'll remember to turn on your phones, because I'm sure you've already turned them all off.
That's a novel way to
I appreciate that those of you who are members, thank you. And if not, hope you'll consider joining at some point. Membership has a big impact to allow us to continue programs like this today. So today we're delighted to welcome Todd Purdum, the author of Something Wonderful, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution. As I just said to him earlier, if he had half as much fun writing it as I did reading it, he had a great time. And I know for those of you who have read it, you enjoy it, and for those of you who haven't, you have something to look forward to. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic, previously worked for the New York Times, where he served as a White House correspondent, diplomatic correspondent, Los Angeles bureau chief, and has been contributing editor of the Vanity Fair, senior writer at Politico. And his other books include An Idea Whose Time Has Come and A Time of Our Choosing. I also am thrilled to welcome our moderator here, Don Aucoin, who's the chief theater critic for the Boston Globe. He has covered city and state government and many campaigns for the Boston Globe, wrote for the Globe magazine, was a TV critic there for several years. He's also co-author of The Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy, and his story on race relations in Boston was included in the Best Newspaper Writing 2006-2007. Join me to welcome our special guests.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, how's this? Okay, Todd, let's begin. 2 weeks ago today, a revisionist and highly polarizing revival of Oklahoma won the 2019 Tony Award for Best Musical Revival. In the 4 or 5 years preceding that, there were major Broadway revivals of The King and I and Carousel. And in 2010, there was a major revival of South Pacific. And from 2015 to 2017, there was a 2-year national tour of The Sound of Music. All of which, by way of preface to this question, what accounts, in your view, for the enduring appeal of Rodgers and Hammerstein?
Well, first of all, Don, thanks for being here today. I think it's safe to say that 76 years after they first teamed up to write Oklahoma, what accounts for their enduring appeal is that they treated real people, real characters, real situations seriously, and they did not write about cartoons. You know, in the 1920s and 30s, musical comedies were about mistaken identity and madcap heiresses and musical beds, and Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote about which of two boys would take a girl to a party, and what happens when a woman loves a man who's hopelessly abusive, what happens when a school teacher from England goes to the Orient to teach children. And I think these stories reflect real themes in human life that are sort of ongoing and eternal, and they'll always be fresh. And because Rodgers and Hammerstein didn't condescend to their subjects, they played it straight, I think those stories have lasted, and of course the wonderful, amazing songs, which have had a life of their own, totally outside of the shows for which they were written. But the thing that I think it's important to remember is virtually every one of their songs was written for a specific character, a specific situation, a specific moment in time in a show, and yet they're sort of universal in their appeal.
Your terrific book is subtitled Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution. You might not think of Oklahoma as revolutionary, but it was in 1943. I'm wondering if you could explain in what ways Oklahoma represented a real seismic jolt for American musical theater in 43.
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed learning more about in writing this book is that, yes, we think these musicals now are kind of canonical, that they're all carved in marble and that they've always been there. And we know them from our high school theater production or dinner theater or the movies that we see. What we don't remember is that when Oklahoma premiered on Broadway, most musical comedies were these frothy things, as I said, kind of cartoonish. They began with a big choral number of dancing boys and girls. The point was distraction and to string along enough plot to hold some songs together. What they did was begin their show the same way the play that it was based on began, with a solitary woman churning butter on the stage and a cowboy off stage singing in the wings, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." And it was so quiet, so naturalistic, that it had the perverse effect of landing on Broadway like a bomb. It was so different. And you could quickly see in the years that followed that their competitors and imitators understood the power that that had had. The other thing about Oklahoma that it's so important to remember, first of all, it integrated dance, story, and song to a degree that had never been successfully done before. So Agnes DeMille's Dream Ballet about the heroines being torn between two lovers. The fact that each song advanced the characters and plot, it wasn't just a standalone. But it premiered in the middle of World War II, and American audiences saw it not just as a reflection of the sacrifices and violence it took to tame the frontier, but of what it would take to win World War II and build a post-war world and win the peace, build the United Nations, if you will. In The Farmer and the Cowman, there's that line about we all got to behave ourselves and act like brothers. And I think the dream of brotherhood was exemplified in Oklahoma, and every performance was filled with servicemen preparing to ship out overseas. And I think part of the emotionalism of this play is related to that, just the way that Irving Berlin's White Christmas had spoken to GIs scattered all around the world.
What we were fighting for.
What we were fighting for, what mattered.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit. They had substantial careers. They met as middle-aged men, not met, but began collaborating. If you could talk a little bit about their prior collaborations and what drew them together.
Well, as you point out, their collaboration was really the result of a midlife crisis for both men. And when they came together, it was almost as if they'd spent their whole lives preparing to work with each other. They both knew virtually everything there was to know about the theater. Oscar Hammerstein was the son and grandson of producers and impresarios. When he was born in 1895, his grandfather and namesake, the first Oscar Hammerstein, was probably the most famous opera and theatrical producer in the world. His father, William, also worked in the family business. And from a very young age, he tried to go to law school. It didn't take. He started working as an office boy, a stage manager, a playwright, eventually a master craftsman, librettist and lyricist. And he had a long and successful collaboration with many people, including, most importantly, the composer Jerome Kern, with whom he wrote Showboat in 1927, which was really the first attempt at a serious musical play to tell the story of 3 generations of a Mississippi riverboat family dealing with interracial love, serious themes. Richard Rodgers, the son of a doctor, grew up loving music. Someone once asked him what he did before he became a composer. He said, "I was a baby." In fact, he was composing by the age of 9. He and Oscar both went to Columbia University, where they fell in love with the Varsity Show, which is the annual spring musical comedy like the Hasty Pudding at Harvard. And Rodgers had a 20-year successful partnership with Lorenz Hart, who was actually a contemporary of Hammerstein's in college. And Rodgers and Hart wrote these beautiful, wonderful standard songs that are performed in cabarets and nightclubs all over the world today, but their shows tended to be of these sillier, frothier plots. And so the shows as shows haven't stood up in the way that Rodgers and Hammerstein's have. But finally, so Rodgers himself had experimented with bringing ballet to Broadway in On Your Toes, choreographed in 1936 by George Balanchine. And then in Pal Joey in 1940 with Lorenz Hart, he dealt with an anti-hero, a heel basically, a kept man who runs a nightclub in Chicago. And so they'd each been pushing the boundaries of Broadway theater for 20 years. And when they came together, it was really like a chemical reaction, and the rest is history.
What did they seek from each other? What did they find in each other?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that Rodgers clearly realized is that Hammerstein, to take nothing away from Rodgers' musical genius, which was, as Joe's playing showed you earlier, in fact, incredible. But Rodgers knew that Hammerstein was the one who was pushing the form, pushing the envelope, and was the serious storyteller, committed to writing about real things and real people. And interestingly, when they came together, they reversed the way of working that each had previously done. Larry Hart and Richard Rodgers wrote the music and lyrics more or less at the same time. Jerome Kern wrote the music first, and Hammerstein set the words to it. Hammerstein, when they teamed up, said to Rodgers, "I'd like to write the words first." And I think the effect that had is that Rodgers was writing the music to characters, feelings, emotions, ideas that were already there on paper. So I think it made their songs deeper and richer and more whole. And, you know, a lot of musicologists prefer the music of Rodgers and Hart because it's so joyous and fizzy. But when Rodgers began working with Hammerstein, he had gone back to take piano lessons with a man who'd been one of George Gershwin's teachers because he felt his musical knowledge and his piano skills especially were not what they should be. And his daughter said that by the time Rodgers began working with Hammerstein, he was very influenced by the romantic 19th century composers like Brahms especially. And so I think Rodgers's music, because it follows the words, is richer and deeper and darker in ways.
So it was more of a marriage of sensibilities than might have been the case before that midlife period.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Now, what inspired you to write the book? Did you grow up listening to the cast albums? Tell me a little bit about how you came to this project.
I did grow up listening to the cast albums. That's what my parents played, and my mother would sing these songs to us in the bathtub. My father's older brother was an actor in New York, and they would go to see him in the early 1960s for a week at a time and come home with 8 playbills after 7 days. I remember one year in 1964, in the same week, they saw Zero Mostel and Fiddler on the Roof, Barbra Streisand in Funny Girl, Carol Channing in Hello Dolly.
The week well spent.
So I'd grown up loving these songs, and my wife, Dee Dee Myers, knew that. So when it came time for me to, I owed my publisher the right of first refusal on another book after writing a book about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which the Kennedy Library was kind enough to have me talk about. Dee Dee said, "You should really write about this because it's what you care about." And thankfully, the publishers agreed, and I'm really grateful.
Did your feelings about Rodgers and Hammerstein change over the course of living with them for the biography?
Yes, I would say they did. I'd always known a fair amount about them. I'd known the basic outlines of their stories. I didn't really understand one important thing, which was that while they were seamless professional collaborators and never had a substantive argument really between them of any consequence about the shows, they weren't personally close, and they were very different personalities, and each went to his grave confessing to friends that he wasn't sure the other had really liked him. And they seldom worked in the same room. They would get together for story conferences to decide where to put the songs, how to sketch out the outlines of the shows. But when it came to brass tacks, Hammerstein worked in his farm in Pennsylvania or his townhouse in Manhattan. Rodgers would work at his apartment in Manhattan or his Connecticut country house, and they would communicate by mail or telephone or messenger. So the fact that they had a kind of ambivalent personal relationship and yet managed to make art that has lasted so long and given so much pleasure to so many people, that to me was an interesting thing to learn and to sort of explore that dynamic.
Was the emotional distance between them a source of disappointment to either of them? I mean, Rodgers had a tormented but close relationship with Larry Hart.
Exactly. They were really, I mean, Rodgers said that when Larry Hart was a very severe alcoholic and a depressive person, and Rodgers talked about on the afternoon he met Larry Hart, he acquired in a single day a partner, a best friend, and a source of constant irritation. I think in some ways he was careful not to get so emotionally involved with Hammerstein, but he found Hammerstein a little bit opaque. Hammerstein found Rodgers emotionally distant, and the secret that came out only long after Rodgers' death, that his daughters revealed at the turn of the 20th century when he would have had his centennial year, is that for much of his life he was a severe but functioning alcoholic, and he's had a period of severe depression in the late 1950s, whereas Oscar really was sort of the cockeyed optimist that he talks about in those lyrics from South Pacific. He was a fundamentally optimistic guy.
Stuck like a dope with a thing called hope.
But the other thing that is true about Oscar, his surrogate son, Stephen Sondheim, pointed out that he didn't have much patience for children who hadn't reached the age of reason. And the problem is by the time a child reaches the age of reason, scars have been inflicted and damage has been done. So, for example, Oscar was very competitive with his own children. Teaching them to ice skate, he would trip them with a stick. He played chess and tennis with his sons for blood. Sondheim actually taught him how to play chess, and Oscar quickly mastered the game. And once when Sondheim thought he had him trapped, Oscar checkmated him, and Sondheim said, what, did you see my move coming? He said, no, Stevie, I heard your heart beating. So he could be a toughie too. And they were both extremely tight with a buck, somewhat stingy with credit, and they were both, they could be difficult people.
I want to talk a little more about the relationship between Oscar and Sondheim later on. I'm wondering, maybe it's one of the mysteries of creation, but how Rodgers, with lifetime depression and alcoholism, was able to create such joyous music.
It's a fascinating question. His daughter, Mary, late in her life, told an interviewer that she thought that no one really knew, not even one of the 5 psychiatrists he went to, what tortured him, what made him tick. He had a somewhat unhappy childhood. He grew up in a home where there was a fair amount of tension. His parents lived in the home of his maternal grandparents, who were wealthy silk merchants. His father was a doctor, as I said, and he recounted long, unhappy silences around the dinner table, but joyous moments around the piano after dinner. So I think he might have been emotionally scarred. One of the things that happens, though, I think with creative people is sometimes great unhappiness can be channeled into expressions of beauty for others. It is a poignant reality that apparently in his personal life he wasn't able to experience the joy that he so often gave to other people.
You spoke earlier about the different kind of music he wrote once he teamed up with Hammerstein vis-a-vis versus that he wrote with Larry Hart. I'm wondering if you could sort of illustrate for us, with the help of Joe, what makes a Richard Rodgers song a Richard Rodgers song?
Well, Don, it's a great question, and music scholars and creative people talk about how hard it is to define what makes a Rodgers song, because he wrote such a diverse array of material. Alec Wilder, the great composer and music scholar, said that he did a study of all the great composers, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Harold Arlen, Lerner and Lowe, and so on, and that he found Rodgers' output was by far the most diverse, the most eclectic. But one thing that people cite as a common trait of Rodgers, and with Joe's help we can show a little bit about this, American popular songs are basically a journey through a series of key changes, coming back to do, as in do a deer. The tonic chord, I'm not a musicologist, but the tone that brings you back to the place where you've come home again. And so what Rodgers' genius was to take you through the song, leading you all along this path through the woods, taking unexpected twists and turns, but somehow making them seem inevitable, and then bringing you satisfyingly back to what we call the tonic chord, the root chord, the do. And so in a song that he wrote with Larry Hart, Joe's going to play, it's called Isn't It Romantic? And he's first going to play the song, it's a very familiar song, the way most composers would have written it. So Joe. And here's what Richard Rodgers wrote. Infinitely more interesting. He flats the note, he gives a blue note, he has this jazz inflection, and your ear goes there and you have this little hair goes up on the back of your neck because it's something you're not expecting. The one written record we have of how they worked together is when they were writing a musical for television in 1957 for Julie Andrews to star as Cinderella. And in the fall of 1956, Oscar had gone to Australia. His wife was Tasmanian for the 1956 Olympics. And they're exchanging letters back and forth. And it's a fascinating window, first of all, because the correspondence that's signed love, but it's very formal, almost as if, well, Mr. Hammerstein and well, Mr. Rodgers. But Oscar has a question about a song that they're writing for the Prince. And he asks Rodgers, it's called Do I Love You Because You're Beautiful, or Are You Beautiful Because I Love You? And the prince is trying to decide why he's falling in love. Are his eyes deceiving him? Is he projecting beauty onto this ordinary woman, or is she really extraordinary? So Oscar asked Dick, is it musically ungrammatical to begin the song in a major key, what we think of as a happy sounding, a minor key, what we think of as a sad sounding key, and then end it in a major key? And Rodgers says, no, it's not ungrammatical at all, and I think you'll be happy with what I did. So Joe can play the song. We're not going to even talk about the words, but you can tell by listening that the prince is going through this mental journey, and I think you'll be able to tell just the moment when he's resolved the question. Pretty moody, pretty doubtful. Feeling a little more optimistic. Home free. Thank you, Joe.
That lyric provides a pretty good jumping off point for a question I wanted to ask you about Oscar's combination of emotional directness and sort of universal wisdom, but also the kind of simplicity that's easy to mock.
Yeah.
He wasn't Cole Porter, he wasn't Yip Harburg, he wasn't, Frank Lesser, he wasn't lots of people. Speak to that a little bit. Was he sort of, did he feel insufficiently celebrated?
I think he was very proud of his simplicity. Sondheim, who was, as I said, his surrogate son, points out that it's easy to mock because he's very naked, he's writing in character, he's not making wonderful wordplay like Cole Porter, and he's not making long lists of songs like Cole Porter. But Oscar himself wrote a book of compilation of his lyrics while he was still alive. And for example, he loved the sparing use of rhyme. He thought that if you didn't rhyme too much or too brilliantly, people listened more. So for example, in Old Man River, which he wrote with Jerome Kern, Old Man River, that old man river, he must know something, but don't say nothing. Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along. He don't plant taters, he don't plant cotton, and them that plants 'em is soon forgotten. And that's the first rhyme, 40 lines into the song. And so I think he thought that was important to make people pay attention. For my money, he can write as funny a song as anyone else. I mean, I Can't Say No from Oklahoma is as funny a song as there ever was, and Ali Stroker just won the Tony Award for performing in a wheelchair. And I never thought a wheelchair could dance, but she makes it clear that it can. So I think he was not ashamed of his simplicity. In fact, I think he took pride in it. And he took pride in defending other people's simplicity. When people would talk about how basic Irving Berlin's songs were, someone said, well, anyone could do that. And Oscar said, yes, but Irving did. So I think he...
That line from Old Man River, those that plant him is soon forgotten, leads me to a question about Oscar's politics, his sort of sense of human rights. Speak to that, because it seems to me that's something, the famous line from South Pacific comes to mind.
You got to be carefully taught. He was a passionate liberal of the most aggressive sort. He was an early advocate in the 30s and 40s for breaking the color line in baseball. After World War II, he and his neighbor in Pennsylvania, Pearl Buck, the Nobel Prize-winning author, helped create Freedom House, which was an orphanage and adoption agency set up to handle the flood of mixed-race children that American GIs had fathered with Asian women during the war, who were greatly stigmatized in the United States at the end of the war. In Hollywood in the 1930s, he was an early crusader against the Nazis. He was on behalf of the Loyalists in Spain. And amazingly, in the 1950s, some of that liberal activity came back to haunt him. And on the very day that he and Richard Rodgers were presiding at a dinner of the B'nai B'rith in Washington with President Eisenhower with them on the dais, Oscar had to write an affidavit to the State Department attesting to his loyalty because they had put him on a restricted passport, which we could only have for 6 months at a time. And that was a real impediment for him because he had a lot of businesses in London. They had shows running in London, and he had to travel. And he wrote, I think, a 35 or 40-page testament to his Americanism. And the notion that now Oscar Hammerstein, who we think of as, vanilla ice cream, could have been seen as a security threat. But the FBI opened a file on him around 1951 or so, and it was still open when he died in 1960.
Remarkable. What did it take? Oh, sorry, a quick question on the politics. Rodgers was apolitical. What did he think of Oscar's political involvements? Was he ever troubled by them?
He never was. There's no evidence that he was troubled by them. I think he is on record as saying that he thought Oscar was sometimes too preachy about things. Rodgers was a conventional, middle-of-the-road liberal. He was an upper-class, rather aristocratic Jew, and he and his wife knew that their daughters weren't welcome in certain clubs or certain cotillions or certain hotels that Gentiles would have been part of. So I think, in the case of South Pacific, Rodgers stood lockstep behind Hammerstein on a question like, should carefully taught stay in the show? But Rodgers was a person who didn't like to rock the boat in general. Whereas Hammerstein was he joined every liberal cause, and he was also very active during World War II in propaganda efforts on the home front to try to build morale for the war. And he was active in every professional trade group, the Writers Guild, the Authors Guild, and so forth. And he often was frustrated by the fact that as the more famous he got, the more committees he was asked to join, and the less time he had for the thing he was really born to do, which was write.
Did he see, though, his political engagement as an extension of his artistic enterprise?
Yes, I think they both very much saw political engagement as an expression and reflection of the artistic enterprise, and they were proud, as they said that night at the dinner with President Eisenhower, that in America there weren't litmus tests for artistic ideas. There wasn't a state theater. There wasn't some kind of art that you had to do to be, accepted in society, that you had freedom to speak your piece.
Wasn't there in the book a sort of ferociously angry letter or letters from objecting to the "You've got to be carefully taught"
Oh, yes,
song?
yes. Just for anyone who might not know, in South Pacific, the plot revolves partly around a young Marine lieutenant from the main line of Philadelphia, Joe Cable, who can't make peace with his love for a Tonkinese girl, and he tries to explain when one character says, a Navy nurse from Arkansas, "This is just born in you." He said, "No, it's not born in you. It happens after you're born. And you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate." So when the show tried out in New Haven, Connecticut in 1949, Oscar got a letter from a naval officer who said, "You could not have interrupted the beautiful flow of entertainment more thoroughly if you'd stopped for a VD lecture in the middle of the show." He said, "It's like drinking a scotch and soda and swallowing the ice cube." And Oscar said, "Well, I think I understand very clearly the point you're trying to make, but I think we're making progress only very slowly." And in 1953, when South Pacific was on tour in Georgia, the Georgia State Legislature passed a resolution condemning that song as communist propaganda. And Oscar's answer was, "I don't see why it's necessary that everything beautiful has to come from Moscow."
On a much less weighty topic, but one that I think the audience might enjoy. Tell us about Mary Martin having to wash her hair so often and wash that man right out of my hair.
Well, it's a famous scene in the play where she's thinking she better not fall in love with this wealthy French planter. She doesn't even yet know that he has 2 mixed-race children, but her mother's warning her that he's too old for her, and he likes Marcel Proust and she likes Dinah Shore, and so she says she's going to wash him out of her hair. And Mary Martin had the idea that she should actually wash her hair on stage. And her husband said, "Oh, for God's sake, don't tell Dick and Oscar, they'll make you do it." Well, of course, she did tell them. And so they made her wash her hair 8 times a week on stage. But because she couldn't get all the shampoo out, she washed it after every show. And then when we woke up in the morning, she washed it again. So she really washed her hair 24 times a week for about 2.5 years on Broadway and another 18 months or so in London. But the interesting thing is, when that number was first staged again in New Haven, the director, Josh Logan, couldn't understand why it didn't get this huge response he was sure it would get. And he realized that because she initially washed her hair as she sang the first chorus, and everyone in the theater was saying, "My God, is she really washing her hair?" And they weren't paying attention to the song. So 2 nights later, he had her sing the song all the way through and then get out the shampoo, and it brought down the house. So It's an interesting reflection of stagecraft.
That's commitment. Josh Logan, he had to really battle for credit on South Pacific. Speak to that.
Yes, Josh Logan was a fellow Princetonian, a brilliant guy, who had also been in the theater for a long time by the time South Pacific rolled around. And what happened was Oscar Hammerstein was a brilliant playwright, but he'd never been in the military. He was rejected from World War I for being underweight. And he didn't understand how the military worked, whereas Josh Logan had grown up the son of a teacher at Culver Military Academy in Indiana, and he'd been in the Army during World War II, touring all over the world with Irving Berlin's This Is the Army All-Soldier Show. So Oscar called him up and said, I don't know how to deal with this. I have the sailors on the beach snapping to attention when this Marine lieutenant comes on the shore. And Logan says, oh my God, they'd pretend he wasn't there. So Logan agrees to go out to Pennsylvania to work with Oscar, and a couple of days turn into a couple of weeks, and they basically write the whole play. And Logan's wife is very nervous because she's like, you should be getting co-author credit on this. So finally, just pretty shortly before the play goes into rehearsals, Logan says, you know, Oscar, I really think I wrote as much of this as you did. And Hammerstein's very embarrassed and says, I'm so sorry I didn't think of it first. But the next day, after consulting with Rodgers and their lawyers, he comes back and says, you can't share copyright with us, and that's not the way we work. So you can have credit as co-author of the book, but the credit has to go in smaller type than our credit as authors of the lyrics and music. And you can't have any copyright, and you can't have any author's royalties. And this cost Logan millions and millions of dollars. And he was so eager to do the show that he did it anyway, but it haunted him to the dying day, the last day of his life. And it's a reflection of the fact that, now, to their credit, when they came time to make the movie of South Pacific, they gave Logan a big percentage of the profits, and it's sort of financially made up. I don't think it ever emotionally made up for what they had done.
Mentioning the movies, I mean, the movies, they don't really capture what makes the show special. South Pacific was a particular debacle, as I recall.
Yeah, Oklahoma's pretty faithful, and everybody sings their own songs, and of course The Sound of Music is a blockbuster, but very different from the play of The Sound of Music. The movie of South Pacific, Logan, who was a manic depressive, and his credo seemed to be more is more. So when they did the play of South Pacific, he had a very innovative approach, which was that he wanted underscoring under the dialogue in the manner of a movie, where there's, you know, dramatic music under the lines. And he wanted seamless scenic changes that would mimic cinematic dissolves. When it came time to the movie, he thought of a theatrical stage technique, which was what lighting can do to change the mood when a musical number is performed. So he came up with this idea to put color filters over the camera when people sang musical numbers. So when Nellie Forbush sings that the sky's a bright canary yellow, the whole screen turns yellow. And 20th Century Fox assured him this process could be removed in the lab afterwards. And so he sort of kept going, but it turns out he couldn't, at least not without great cost. So the movie, if you see it to this day, and you're on a color television set, you think something's gone wrong with your set, because it suddenly just goes, and then Some Enchanted Evening is all blue and something else is all red. And he was really, and he came on in tremendous critical drubbing for it, and he regretted it to the end of his days.
What did it take to seize the joint imaginations of Rodgers and Hammerstein? What had to be present in a project for them to consider it worthwhile? Because they were tremendously busy men.
They were very busy. They famously turned down a couple of things. They turned down what became Fiddler on the Roof. They turned down what became My Fair Lady. Oscar said they didn't want anything that looked like a typical musical comedy. So I think one thing that often had to be present was an implicit challenge. Like in the case of Carousel, which was based on the play Lilium, in which the hero is a wife beater and kills himself partway through the second act. I think they thought, how do we make that into an appealing musical play? In The King and I, how do we handle this school teacher who goes halfway around the world and never kisses the guy that she's sort of quietly in love with, but has an incredibly sexy dance that they do to the polka? So I think Rodgers' grandson, Adam Gettle, said it isn't that they went out looking for controversial topics, they went out looking for good stories. Pardon me, but because they were so artistically skilled and ultimately so commercially successful, they had the power and the muscle to take on these stories that other people wouldn't have taken on. And I think they liked a challenge. I think they liked, the minute someone said, oh, you can't do that, then I think that was probably the thing that said, well, we'd like to try.
Now, we're both journalists, and journalists are ever searching for local angles, and there are a lot of local angles, Boston angles, that is, with Rodgers and Hammerstein. And I'm wondering if you could tell me something you mentioned to me earlier about them writing Getting to Know You from The King and I in Boston.
Well, so many important things happened in Boston. In South Pacific, when Lieutenant Cable and Liat first make love, they'd originally written a song called My Friend, our day is at an end. Josh Logan's like, really? After this lusty Marine? I don't think so. So then he's like, and Rodgers is not very pleased. He said, okay. So they go back and write a song that goes, suddenly lucky, suddenly arms are lucky, suddenly our lips have kissed.
Huh.
And Logan's like, that's better, but remember, he's a Marine.
Yeah.
So then they come up with Younger Than Springtime. But The King and I is trying out in Boston, and they're kind of struggling, and the show is running too long. And everyone says, what we need is a number for Mrs. Anna, the school teacher, and the children to show how they're loving her and she's loving them. So Suddenly Lucky becomes Getting to Know You.
Huh.
And that was put into the show in Boston, and most people think it was a big part of making the show a hit. Years later, in The Sound of Music, when they were trying out in Boston, Oscar Hammerstein had been diagnosed with cancer. He missed the tryout in New Haven. He first saw the show in Boston. Once again, they decided something was missing in the second act, and that Captain Von Trapp needed a song to show how music affected him and his children. And Richard Rodgers wrote a tune. Oscar Hammerstein came to meet him in the Ritz-Carlton, I guess, which is now the Taj on the Common. And they got a piano in a room, and Oscar wrote Edelweiss, the last song he ever wrote in Boston.
That's heartbreaking when you think of that song, to think of those being the last words Hammerstein wrote. Some in the audience might remember the legendary drama critic Elliot Norton, and you had mentioned that, Elliot fans in the house? Good. That Rodgers and Hammerstein revised aspects of Carousel after Elliot's withering review, or?
I think Norton gave a pretty sympathetic review to Carousel, but one of the things, Elliot Norton, he was for the transcript, right?
The Herald Travel.
The Herald Travel. And he had a conception of a critic which would not be considered kosher today, which was that in addition to telling newspaper readers what he thought, he fancied himself a little bit of a play doctor, and he would give advice to the authors about what they might do to fix it. And he was very candid. So, for example, when Allegro came to Boston, he liked the first act, he didn't like the second act. That became the kind of conventional wisdom. But again, they respected his criticism very much, and typically during the tryouts here, they would not only read his review, but I think often they would meet privately with him too to take his temperature.
Yeah, that would not be kosher today. With The Odd Couple, Neil Simon rewrote The Odd Couple based on something Elliot said, where he said on his Channel 2 show, you know who I really missed in Act 2 was those Pigeon Sisters. And Simon went back and rewrote it and greatly foregrounded the Pigeon Sisters. The story I've heard of may be apocryphal, but Oklahoma premiered in 1943 at the Colonial Theater, then called Away We Go. And I think it was a Globe reviewer who said, good show, but they need to work on the title, and they did. But a story I want to ask you about was that the first time the title song was sung as a choral number was on the staircase at the Colonial, that Oscar and Dick said, let's see how it sounds. How much of that is apocryphal?
I think it's true. What happened was the title song, Oklahoma, was originally going to be sung just by Curly, the cowboy, at the end of the show. And a chorus member apparently said at some point in New Haven, wouldn't it be better if the whole company sang that song?
Duh.
And by that point, the orchestrator, Robert Russell Bennett, was already back in New York. So he took the train from New York to Boston on a Sunday morning, and he's the one who came up with that driving, rhythmic, spelling lesson, O-K-L-A-H. And they went to the Colonial Theater, and Jay Blackton, the conductor, taught the chorus the song, and I believe maybe in the ladies' lounge downstairs or on the stairway or something. And then they staged it for the first time, and Ruben Mamoulian, the director, and Agnes DeMille had the whole cast come down to the footlights in a kind of flying wedge. And Blackton recounted how the first time it was performed, he had his back to the audience conducting the orchestra. So he said, I couldn't see them, but boy, could I hear them. And apparently it was pandemonium. And that was another thing that they think really sealed the fate of that show, that it just, gave the punch that it needed.
That is so great. The current Broadway star Sutton Foster, whom some of you might be familiar with, when she was a young actress auditioning, she sang the title song from Oklahoma as a solo number, which amuses her quite a bit now. Tell me about Trudy Rittman, the orchestrator, and the relationship she had with Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Trudy Rittman was a brilliant pianist and musician who had fled Nazi Germany and come to New York to work in the ballet. And she worked with Agnes DeMille, who, of course, became the choreographer of Oklahoma. We think the first Rodgers and Hammerstein show she worked on was Carousel, and we think she might have done some of the underscoring in that show. She was crucially responsible for what we think of as the Rodgers and Hammerstein sound, but she didn't get the credit she deserved much of the time. Sometimes she was credited with vocal or dance arrangements when she'd actually written original compositions. So in The King and I, when they have the ballet about the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin so that children can teach the king about the evils of slavery, Trudy wrote in a completely original piece of music that Richard Rodgers signed. And in Do Re Mi, in The Sound of Music, obviously Rodgers wrote that song, but there's a part that you'll all remember, which Joe will play in a second, and this is 100% Trudy written. So anyone of my generation, that's part of Do Re Mi, and it's really, so it's a little bit sad. She didn't push for the credit she deserved. She was a very rare example of a woman working in what was then a man's world. She put up with it and took it. She wound up living in retirement in Waltham in somewhat reduced circumstances. And in later years, long after Rodgers and Hammerstein themselves had died, the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization agreed to give her sort of a small monthly stipend in token of appreciation for all that she'd done. But it's really a sad story about how people don't always get the credit that they deserve, and if they're not willing to fight for it themselves, sometimes people aren't willing to fight on their behalf. But one of the happy things for me in doing the book is I made contact with her great niece who lives in London, and they are sending Trudy's papers to the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, where they can be in the collection and she can maybe get a little bit more of the credit she deserves.
Nice. On the subject of the treatment of women, Richard Rodgers, it seems fair to say, would not have fared well or lasted long in the Me Too era. Speak to that.
No. Barbara Cook in a documentary once said that he was a womanizer, and then she thought better of it and said he was a young girlizer. And she recounted how she was only spared his approach because when she went to audition for him, he was suffering from gout. And his foot was propped up so he couldn't chase her around. But Shirley Jones tells a very frank story about how when she was cast in the movie of Oklahoma as a 19-year-old newcomer out of Smithton, Pennsylvania, Rodgers shut his office door and made a cold-blooded pass. He was about 36 years older than she was, and she said the only thing she knew to shut him down was to say, "Oh, Mr. Rodgers, I'll always think of you as a father." And that stopped him in his tracks. He famously said once, though, he watched a chorus girl, in those days, Broadway musicals went on the road to try out before opening in New York. And two of the best tryout cities were New Haven in Connecticut and Boston. So a chorus girl apparently slapped her left hip and said, "Well, I gained this weight in New Haven," and slapped her right hip and said, "I gained this in Boston." And Rodgers said, "Well, I prefer Providence myself." But anyway, I don't think he would have come in for a lot of scrutiny today.
He supposedly liked Boston so much as a tryout town that he once said, "I wouldn't open a can of tomatoes without taking it to Boston first."
I believe it. I believe it. His daughters both said that he loved everything about being on the road. He loved the cold coffee and the dry sandwiches and the greasy spoons, and I'm sure they were often having room service at the Ritz, so it wasn't that bad either. Yeah. But he did like the whole act of putting the shows together. And one of the things that's interesting to remember is we think of these shows as I said maybe earlier, as canonical. They all came together with blood and sweat and tears and the best you could do, and gum and toothpicks under tremendous pressure. Carousel underwent a lot of revisions in Boston too before it went to New York. And I think it's one of the fun parts about the book was to try to put myself back in imagining when they were writing these shows, they didn't know whether they were going to be a hit or not. Now, of course, we know the ones that were and the ones that weren't. But for them, each thing was a whole new risk.
And yet, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but their commercial instincts were extraordinary, weren't they? I mean,
they really were. Sometimes, Rodgers once said, "I think the most commercial thing you can do is not think about being commercial, but think about being creative." Mm-hmm. And that people would buy the product if it was good. It's an interesting reflection, though, because they really were, they were very keen businessmen.
Yes.
One of the first things they did was set up their own music publishing company after Oklahoma. In those days, the copyrights for songs were usually held by the publishers. Authors would get royalties, percentage of sheet music sales, and so on. But Rodgers and Hammerstein wanted to have their own company. They also pioneered the art of recording original cast albums of Broadway shows. That was another revenue source. With South Pacific, they came up with marketing tie-ins for consumer products, which of course we now know in the movie business, from Disney to Marvel to DC to everybody, is a huge revenue source. They came up with silk scarves and ties and pajamas for South Pacific, and a home permanent formula because of Mary Martin's washing her hair, a line of dolls. So they were awfully clever about how they could maximize, and they really contrived, from South Pacific onward especially, to own their product, because when they'd worked in Hollywood, they'd both been frustrated by being a small cog in a machine where they didn't have ownership of their work. Oscar Hammerstein said, I was selling my words instead of gambling with them. And he wanted to be gambling on his own account, taking the risk but getting the reward.
Given their mammoth success, how much professional envy was directed their way, and by whom?
I think pretty much by everybody. Cole Porter once said Rodgers and Hammerstein have made life harder for everybody on Broadway. But the thing that's equally true is they'd made life harder for themselves. So it was harder and harder for them to top themselves. It's fascinating to think now that when The King and I came out in 1951, 2 years after South Pacific, and we know those songs to this day, I Have Dreamed, Hello Young Lovers, that's a wonderful score. The nearly uniform critical reaction was, well, it's okay, but it's no South Pacific. And so I think they were the envy of their peers, but nobody didn't respect them. And they realized these guys have really worked to earn it.
You referred earlier to Stephen Sondheim as Oscar's surrogate son. Sondheim has been quoted frequently as saying, if Oscar had been a geologist, I would have become a geologist. I think we're all grateful that neither of them became geologists, but I've always been fascinated by this because Sondheim seems light years away. Sensibility, worldview, lyrical style. Speak to that a little bit about how Oscar has given us Stephen Sondheim in a certain way, and yet Sondheim went in a completely different direction.
Well, at the basic level, Sondheim has said that he owes Oscar Hammerstein his life. He was the son of a very unhappy childhood. His parents got divorced. His mother alternately smothered him and rejected him. And she bought a house in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, near the Hammersteins. And Oscar Hammerstein and his second wife, Dorothy, had a son, James, who was Sondheim's age, and they were schoolmates at a school called the George School, a Quaker school in Pennsylvania. And Sondheim came to dinner one night and sort of never left. Oscar, when he was at Williams College, made him a gopher on their production of Allegro, which was one of their really few flops. Oscar also set him to the task of playwriting. He asked him to write an original story, an adapted story, a comedic story, and so on. And when Sondheim came back with the first effort, he was eager for Hammerstein's reaction. He said, "Do you want to know what I think?" And Hammerstein said, "It's pretty terrible." And tears began to form in Sondheim's eyes. He said, "I don't mean that you don't have talent." He said, "But you're trying to write like me. You have to write like yourself. You have to write in your own voice, and you have to find what matters to you." There's a famous story about how when Sondheim was working on Gypsy with Julie Stein, and the finale of that show, as you may know, is when the mother, who herself has been a fierce stage mother but never gotten the reward herself, she sings this kind of nervous breakdown soliloquy called Rose's Turn, in which Sondheim and Julie Stein and the director Jerome Robbins wanted the number to be interrupted by the arrival of the daughter on her stage and not give Ethel Merman the great big hand that she deserved. And Hammerstein said, "I know why you want to do that psychologically, but dramaturgically it's unsound. You've got to give the audience the chance to release and give Ethel Merman this big applause, and then they will listen to the last scene of dialogue after they've got it out of their system." So I think Sondheim himself has said that, this Allegro was this experimental play with Rodgers and Hammerstein, and Sondheim has said, "I've spent most of my life trying to fix the second act of Allegro." So I think he felt licensed from Hammerstein to go his own way, but Hammerstein taught him the importance of craft, of precision, of dedication, and authenticity more than anything.
It's an endlessly fascinating relationship, and it's a posthumous one, but Sondheim still seems very much shaped by Oscar. You referred to Allegro, and it is one of their rare flops. How did they cope with the occasional flop? Did it create tensions in their relationship, or did it redouble their efforts towards the next thing?
Well, Allegro redoubled their efforts in the sense that the next show after that was South Pacific, and James Michener, on whose novel South Pacific is based, said those fellows were so mad, I knew they could make a great musical out of 3 pages of the Bronx telephone directory. But Allegro was meant to be a sort of very spare, Our Town type story of the life of a doctor. And it just got all bollocksed up. It got scenically very complex. Oscar was trying to tell the story, really, of his own life, of what happens when someone who's so successful that he gets dragged away to be members of committees and heads of boards, and he doesn't have time to pursue his passion, in the case of his hero being a good doctor, in his own case, writing Broadway musicals.
Sure.
And the irony of the show is that while he was writing it, Oscar proved the point. He was so busy being Oscar Hammerstein that in some ways it's inferior work. And as Sondheim said, the gulf between the novelty and daringness of the concept and the somewhat pedestrian book that Hammerstein actually turned out exposed the flaw in the flu. But in the 50s, they had two pretty big flops. One was called Me and Juliet, a kind of backstage melodrama, and another called Pipe Dream, which was based on a novel by John Steinbeck about this prostitutes in Monterey. And the problem with that, Billy Rose, the producer, said, you know why Oscar shouldn't have written that show? He's never been in a whorehouse in his life. and they couldn't make up their minds. Rodgers and Hammerstein was a family brand, and they weren't sure what to do. So Steinbeck complained, "You've made my hooker into a visiting nurse." And I think so. In that case, I think it did shake Rodgers, and I think that's part of what helped lead to his big depression. Because in the immediate aftermath, My Fair Lady took Broadway by storm, and remember, they turned down My Fair Lady partly to do Pipe Dream. So I think that did have an effect on him.
Oof. It's fascinating to think about what My Fair Lady might have been. It turned out pretty well as is, I guess. The director, Anne Bogart, told me recently that she did I knew this, she did a production of South Pacific set about 30 years ago in a veteran psychiatric ward, and she got a tremendous amount of pushback from the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization, which is famously vigilant about adaptations. But now, as we were discussing earlier, there's this very dark, revisionist, bloody-minded revival of Oklahoma on stage at Broadway. A, what were your dealings with the R&H organization like? And B, are they loosening the reins, and why?
A, my dealings were very congenial, and they couldn't have helped me more. But historically, they have a reputation, may I say, a little bit like the Kennedy Library at an earlier era of management, of being very difficult and very protective about the legacy of their patrimony. In those days, Dorothy Hammerstein and Dorothy Rodgers in particular were still alive when Anne Bogart was probably doing her production. And they wanted, as Richard Rodgers himself had, subsequent productions to have an almost Amber-like fidelity to the original. That you didn't want to, budge off the mark of what it should be. I think one thing that's happening now is the family sold the company in 2009. It's since been sold again. Mm-hmm. And Oklahoma's 76 years old. So sometime in the next 20, 25 years, the copyrights of these works are going to begin expiring. And I think the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization knows that to stay alive and to stay vibrant with a new generation of theater goers and listeners, they have to be willing to experiment a little bit more. For example, they let Ariana Grande do this song, which is a very heavy sampling of My Favorite Things. It's totally, I think it's easy to say that it's not in keeping with the spirit of the song and the Sound of Music, and yet it's sort of brilliant in its own way, and Rodgers and Hammerstein gets 85% of the royalties. So I think they want to maximize the exposure of these works for a younger generation, and in answer to your question, yes, I do think they're loosening the reins a little bit, while still also making sure that these productions, even if they're daring and innovative, are in the hands of first-class theater artists. I mean, I don't think they'd give permission for, Dorchester High School to do this or something like that, you know what I mean? So.
Well, while watching the current Broadway revival, I kept thinking, what would Oscar and Dick think? What do you think Oscar and Dick would think?
Well, I'm not a medium, so I'm hesitant to say, but I do think, and I don't mean this in a cynical way, but I think they would love the ka-ching factor, and I think they would love that their show, 76 years after it's premiered, won the Tony Award again. I mean, I think, of course, the Tony Award didn't exist when Oklahoma premiered, so I think they would be pretty thrilled about they never hesitated to be popular. They were not snobs. They loved it that people liked them. Mm-hmm. They loved it that the public liked the Sound of Music even when the critics hated it.
Yep.
And Oscar Hammerstein used to there's a song in Me and Juliet that refers to the audience as the big black giant. And he thought the one critic that could never be wrong was the audience. And if the audience rejected your play, he said, then you'd done something wrong. Because if you couldn't make them follow you, it was like a horse who didn't follow your lead. you were at fault.
Interesting. And you'll go back to that Oscar story about Gypsy. Did they have a favorite musical of the ones they created?
Rodgers is frank that Carousel was his favorite by far. He thought the score was the best. He liked it the best. I wasn't able to find that Hammerstein was on record as saying that he had a favorite musical. I think he would rank Oh, What a Beautiful Morning right up there with his favorite song. He predicted that, although the Surrey with a Fringe on Top always made him cry every time he heard it, but he predicted that Oh, What a Beautiful Morning would be sung in schools and camps and at the beginning of the day, and I think he's probably been vindicated by that. He certainly thought it would ultimately be an even bigger hit than People Will Say We're in Love. And once again, he was very proud of that song because it's not a standard 32-bar Tin Pan Alley song. It's more like a folk song with a repeating verse and chorus. And when his son Bill in the Navy in World War II questioned him, he's like, Dad, I don't know, that seems like an unusual form. Oscar said, oh, you mean like Dixie and Home Sweet Home? And so I think he was very proud of that.
Where do you see Oscar and Dick's fingerprints on today's musical theater, apart from revivals of their own work?
Well,
it's hard to see them in Hadestown, for example.
No, I mean, someone said to me yesterday at an event at the Smithsonian, didn't I see Andrew Lloyd Webber as an heir to Rodgers? And certainly Andrew Lloyd Webber's a big fan of Rodgers. He grew up idolizing Rodgers. And if you talk about the durability of Andrew Lloyd Webber's work and his, melodic gift, I think you'd have to give Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton credit as standing on the shoulders of Rodgers and Hammerstein, albeit in a very different form. But I mean, in two ways. One, in pushing the envelope beyond what was standard Broadway practice, and certainly in the unobtainability of tickets. I mean, both Oklahoma and South Pacific were the original Hamilton in the sense that it was so hard to get tickets to South Pacific that souvenir stores printed fake ticket stubs so people could put them on their coffee table as if they'd been when they wouldn't go. And scalping was so rife that the city of New York threatened to shut down the Majestic Theater box office because the scalping was so intense. There's also a famous story about Oklahoma. Oscar Hammerstein's farm manager in Pennsylvania asked for tickets for his son who was getting married. And Oscar said, when is the wedding? And the farmer said, the day you can get the tickets.
How involved did they get with the casting of their shows?
Oh, intimately involved. I mean, I don't mean intimately in that way, but very, very involved. And after they became Rodgers and Hammerstein and had a whole Rodgers and Hammerstein Inc., they were famous for having these Thursday open auditions at the St. James Theater in New York, and anyone could come and audition to take a place in one of their road companies or replacement casts on Broadway. And as part of that process, that's where they found Shirley Jones, Shirley MacLaine, all kinds of people over the years. People as diverse as Shelley Winters, one of her early roles was a replacement Ado Annie on Broadway. Cloris Leachman was a replacement Nellie Forbush in South Pacific around 1950 or 51.
That works.
Sal Mineo was one of the Prince Chulalongkorn in The King and I. And of course, people like John Reid and Florence Henderson, they found in those same audition processes. So one of the things that they particularly liked, they liked their shows to be the star. So they worked with many stars and they helped make others, but they really liked the show to take top billing. There's a famous story about how Mary Martin's husband, Richard Halliday, who was a very difficult person and an alcoholic and kind of a disagreeable guy, in The Sound of Music on Broadway, it was his idea that Maria should be discovered, as indeed she was, singing the title song in a tree when the curtain rises. But then he thought when she has to run back to the Abbey, it would be adorable if she caught her bloomers in the tree and exposed her underwear. And Rodgers and Hammerstein didn't think that was very appropriate for a postulant to begin with. And Halliday slammed the door and stormed out and said, the trouble with you guys is all you care about is the show. And that was true. They cared about the show much more than the star.
Well, yeah, I guess that leads me to my final question before we throw open the floor to questions, which is getting back to the theme of revolution and the subtitle of your book. Was the Rodgers and Hammerstein revolution in part a revolution of quality, of craft, with the eye towards, the casting and all the details that they paid attention to, as well as, what they did with Oklahoma?
I definitely think it was. I think they didn't take themselves too seriously, but they took their work very seriously, and they were really involved in every aspect of it. One of the things that's fascinating is Hammerstein is on record as saying, you shouldn't be in the theater if you don't like collaboration, because it's inherently collaborative. So a famous example is, in South Pacific, Richard Rodgers was lightning fast as a composer. So it's a true story that he wrote Bali High in 5 minutes over lunch at Josh Logan's apartment. But what also is true is that he'd been thinking for months about that, where that song would come in the show. He knew it was supposed to sound mysterious and oriental. He knew it was going to be sung by a contralto with a deep female voice. He knew it had to convey a feeling of longing of Lieutenant Cable wanting to go to Bali High. And Hammerstein had written these lyrics, remember. But then what happened is after the first pass, the scenic designer Joe Milziner had drawn a sketch, a watercolor sketch, of the island with 2 peaks and clouds obscuring part of the peaks. So Hammerstein went back to his desk and wrote, "Someday you'll find me floating in the sunshine, my head sticking out of a low-flying cloud." Because he'd seen the scenic designer's drawing, he changed the lyrics. And that's collaboration. I mean, that's theater.
And the mixture of pragmatism and creativity, too.
Exactly.
Yeah, using the materials at hand. I guess now we're going to throw it open to questions. You guys, any questions you have for Mr. Purdum?
There are microphones in both aisles.
First of all, thank you for coming. It was a great book. But I would like to just ask you, I've heard, and many people have heard for years and years, that maybe you could tell if this story is true or false, that in Brooklyn many years ago, a woman had gone up to Richard Rodgers' mother and said, "Oh, Mrs. Rodgers, I saw your son's play. It was very good. He's very lucky." And Mrs. Rodgers turned to this woman and said, "You know, the harder and harder my son works, the luckier and luckier he gets."
I don't know, but it's a great story. It's like Ben Hogan's anecdote about golf, or someone else, Fred Astaire's, about dancing. I think it should be true if it isn't, because he really did work very hard. And there's a great quote from Rodgers about inspiration. He said, you don't just, have inspiration dawn on you, but you might look at a mountain or a sunset or an ocean at high tide or low tide, and it goes inside of you and it becomes part of you, and eventually you express yourself. So he took umbrage at the fact that it was so easy for him so he could write so quickly. He told Johnny Carson late in his life, "I rather resent the fact that people say I just perspired these tunes. Every time I have to go up and reach for them, I have to reach again." So I think they both, Dick and Oscar, were total advocates of hard work, and they certainly were lucky because they worked hard.
Thank you.
Yes, you talked about Oscar's progressive politics, and then you also mentioned the theme from Carousel, and I've often been quite puzzled. How did he allow a theme that shows a certain level of sympathy or sensitivity to basically a wife abuser?
That's really a problematic question, and it was something that I think was particularly difficult in the recent Broadway revival. The producers and creators behind that couldn't quite work up their minds what they wanted to do about that. The play was written in the 19-teens by a Hungarian playwright, Ferenc Molnár, and for much of the 20th century, it was seen as this tender, poignant expression of ill-starred love. And the line at the end of the play is the daughter, who's slapped by her father, returned from heaven for a day, asks her mother, "Is it possible for someone to hit you and not have it really hurt at all?" And the mother says, "It's possible for someone to beat you and beat you and beat you and not feel a thing." And that line was dropped from the recent Broadway revival. I think it's just one of those things where changing cultural assumptions have made it much harder to hear. But it's worth noting that in 1945, when they were working on Carousel, they had a vigorous discussion among themselves about how that kind of a character would go over. And Teresa Helburn, who was one of the producers of the Theater Guild, which produced the show, said her informal surveys of people about the character of Billy Bigelow had led people to say that, well, yes, he's a rascal, but what an adorable rascal, and that she thought that people would think of him as sort of like Clark Gable, dangerous and maybe a little bit dark, but ultimately forgivable. I think one of the things about Carousel that you do see in the end of the first act, when Billy realizes he's going to have a child, and he momentarily contemplates that as it might be a daughter, and he realizes that for the first time in his life he has to step up and be a man. And then, of course, just a few scenes later, he isn't a man. He kills himself rather than face the music when he's facing arrest. But that last line of the song, "I never knew how to make money, but I'll try, by God, I'll try. I'll go out and make it or steal it or take it or die." And I think It's a cultural artifact, is all I can say, Carousel. And I think, personally, I think I don't know if you have a view about this, Don, but I think the most recent production directed by Jack O'Brien on Broadway should probably have let it stand and let the audience be horrified rather than try to sand it down and pretend it wasn't there, because it is there, and maybe part of the point of it is each generation has to react to it in its own way.
That's part of a broader debate in theater right now about how to deal with these problematic shows.
My Fair Lady, Kiss Me Kate, etc.
Exactly.
I wondered if you could elaborate a little more on You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. That had to be hugely controversial in 1949 to be talking about interracial marriage and prejudice and racism. I wonder what the audience reaction was to the song and the critics' reaction to the song in the early months of the show. And I had heard, correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a lot of pressure to take it out, but that might have been why they got the Pulitzer Prize for drama.
I don't know about the Pulitzer Prize, but there was definitely a lot of pressure to take it out. And Rodgers and Hammerstein and James Michener himself all said, no, we think it's core to the story. But interestingly, it wasn't just, say, a naval officer who you might have thought was conservative. It was liberal critics. The Saturday Review of Literature, John Mason Brown, who was one of the reigning Broadway critics of his day, said this has no place in the show. It smacks of dragged-in didacticism. The New Yorker said it's just a little bit embarrassing. People were made uncomfortable that in a musical theater entertainment you should have basically a kind of a very effective Sunday morning sermon, and I think I haven't heard a lot of, I haven't heard cases of audiences walking out or something, but there's, in Oscar's papers, there's a lot of vigorous pushback from people about that, and it became a big flashpoint for a lot of people, and interestingly, as I say, liberal critics were just as critical about it.
Follow-up, actually, on that. You got to be taught. I think when you mentioned your family, my parents saw South Pacific on opening night in Boston.
Wow.
And I think that imprinted it on my brother and myself, following South Pacific and Oscar, Rodgers and Hammerstein. But I heard the story that Elliot Norton went to Rodgers and Hammerstein and said, take out, You've Got to Be Taught. This is Boston. Is there any truth to that?
You mean, in other words, Bostonians don't need a lecture about this?
No, Boston won't accept it.
Oh, interesting. Oh, because of, sorry,
Boston will not
yeah.
accept
Last major. I didn't find specifically that, but I have no doubt that it's probably true because it's something that Eliot would have been likely to do in terms of reflecting his own views. He was brutal in Carousel, for example. Oscar Hammerstein had come up with the notion that when Billy goes off to heaven, heaven turns out to be a New England parlor with a Mr. and Mrs. God. And he's shocked to find that God is half man and half woman. And the wife says, don't worry, it takes a while to get used to it. But it's a very funny scene. It's a sort of proto-feminist scene. And Elliot Norton said, this conception of heaven is alien to the New England tradition. And after all, the show was set in New England and out of keeping with the dramaturgy. So that's when they came up with the idea of the star keeper hanging stars on a clothesline instead. But Agnes DeMille always regretted that Oscar changed that, and she thought that the Mr. and Mrs. God was a wonderful idea.
And one final point, if I can, I heard Sinatra say at one point that Richard Rodgers used to drive him crazy because he wouldn't allow him to change the tempo of the songs. Is that true?
He was a famous stickler for having the songs performed exactly as they were written, especially in the theater. Barbara Cook talked about how when she played Carrie Pipperidge in a revival of Carousel years later, he wanted her to wiggle her bustle just the way Jean Darling, the original character, had. She said, Mr. Rodgers, that doesn't feel authentic to me. I think I can get a laugh another way. Can I try? But the most famous example is Peggy Lee recorded an up-tempo, driving Latin version of Lover, which was a Rodgers and Hart song. And Rodgers is supposed to have either said, you know, Miss Lee, it's a waltz, or more crudely to someone else, why couldn't Peggy have effed up Silent Night? But later, he wrote Dave Brubeck, who'd had a jazz album of My Favorite Things, that he loved the interpretation and thought it was keeping the music fresh. But yes, he was a real stickler for tempo, just exactly the way he had written it. He didn't want a lot of fooling around.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both for sharing your insights and research with us today. It's pretty well established in college-level coursework that Oklahoma is sort of the turning point or foundation of modern musical theater. Do you have any sense that Rodgers and Hammerstein understood that that was where they were, or was this just another risk that they were taking in the course of their work?
That's a really good question. I don't think they had a self-conscious sense as they were doing it that they were changing things forever. Because remember, each of them had already changed things quite substantially. Hammerstein with Showboat, Rodgers with On Your Toes, and Pal Joey. I think they thought they were being faithful to their source material. I've been talking about the book so much, forgive me. Did I say that Hammerstein initially debated how to begin Oklahoma? He thought, should we have a strawberry picking festival, a quilting bee, a barn raising? Because, of course, every show has to begin with a choral number. It can't begin with this quiet scene in a butter churn. And in the end, they decided, no, the only way to begin it was with this quiet scene. So I think what they felt they were definitely trying to do was be faithful to the story and faithful to the characters. And then I do think they probably pretty quickly realized, hey, we did something. But, you know, Barbara Cook, the late Broadway singer and wonderful singer, she used to say in one of her cabaret acts, they tell me I was living in a golden age on Broadway. I didn't think I was living in a golden age. I thought, yeah, I got to go get my hair done and get the next job and whatever. She said, do you suppose we could be living in a golden age right now? I think the answer is no. But I think when you're in a moment, you may not know it. You know.
Thank you. An original Broadway cast performance of South Pacific is my earliest theatrical memory. I was 6, and I remember the whole thing. The question I have is perhaps a little bit oblique, but the temptation to ask it is too strong. How do you feel that the score for Victory at Sea fits into Richard Rodgers' life's work?
How does the score for Victory at Sea fit into his life's work? Well, it was hugely popular. This is a score for an NBC documentary about American naval action in World War II. And it was 13 hours of music. Now, Rodgers wrote something like 45 or 50 minutes of tunes, which were then turned into symphonic orchestrations by his collaborator, Robert Russell Bennett. But Rodgers did once say that of all the awards he'd received, the one he was proudest of was a special commendation from the Navy for writing that score. And it was the favorite musical composition of a certain president who, in the depths of Watergate, would retreat to the Lincoln sitting room of the White House, light a fire, make the air conditioning colder, and put on Victory at Sea. He also put it on in 1968, the night he won the presidency. All his family had gone to bed, and he went to his study and put on Victory at Sea. So it was both his happy place and his melancholy place. But it remains a hugely popular album. But as I've been going around the country on book tour, I would say especially men of a certain age and maybe veterans and naval veterans in particular love that score and still do to this day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
More on South Pacific. I was in a high school version of South Pacific as a sailor, and many of our cast got back and saw the recent revival, which we all enjoyed. After reading your book, which I really enjoyed, I finally picked up Tales of the South Pacific to read, and that was wonderful. It was interesting to find a little snippet of the plot here, snippet of the plot there. I was most surprised in one of the chapters on Nellie to read almost verbatim Nellie and Emile thinking to themselves, first, I wonder how it feels sitting on a hilltop. And, Nellie saying, this is how it feels. So to see those lines grabbed was really fascinating. Anything else to share about Michener collaboration?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Michener's book, it's billed as a novel, but it's really a kind of a collection of disconnected short stories. But in Oscar's own copy of Tales of the South Pacific, which is in the Library of Congress, that passage you speak of is underlined in pencil. And you can see that he has grease pencil in the margin. He's thinking, this exchange can make a great lyric. And Alan J. Lerner, I think, once said a good lyric is worth 13 pages of dialogue or something like that, that you can compress something. And when Howard Reinheimer was Rodgers and Hammerstein's brilliant and hard bargaining lawyer, bought Tales of the South Pacific, the rights, he said to Michener, your book's not worth much. It doesn't hang together. It's just a bunch of stories. And so he was trying to, get the price down. But the truth is, the story we know now, Oscar took parts of about 6 stories and wove them together. And initially they thought that the main thrust of South Pacific would be from the story Faux Dalla about the romance of Cable and Liat. And the more they got to thinking about that, they thought that would seem like a 20th century Madame Butterfly. And they found the more original, compelling story was Nellie and the Older Planter, which was in a story called Our Heroine. And so they made 2 pairs of lovers. And, in Oklahoma or Carousel or so many shows, the main leads are romantic and the secondary leads are comic. In South Pacific, both the main and the secondary leads are romantic and the secondary leads are tragic because Cable, the northerner, can't overcome his prejudice, and so in dramaturgical terms he must die. Nellie, the southerner, realizes that this is, she says, is piffle, agrees to be with Emile and his mixed-race children and presumably marry them and go on and build a blended family. But one of the really great things about archival research is when you see in Hammerstein's own hand his initial, by the way, he wasn't infallible. There are some real clinkers in the early drafts. In The Sound of Music, he's writing So Long, Farewell in the summer of 1959 when Hawaii became a state. This is an original draft. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, aloha. I hate to say the time has come to go-ha. And so I told my children this is absolute testament to the necessity of a second draft. But
how much control did Rodgers and Hammerstein have over the movies? How much did they retain? And was there a movie that they particularly liked or were disappointed in when they wanted to do over?
Very good question. They had extreme control over Oklahoma, which was the first movie they made. They set up their own company to produce it. And they really were very intimately involved in every aspect of it. There's a passage where Rodgers talks about how the orchestration should sound as Gordon MacRae rides through that cornfield, which is planted in Arizona. They didn't have almost any involvement in The King and I and Carousel, and that's because 20th Century Fox, by virtue of intellectual property rights that it had retained from previous versions of those stories, really already had the film rights tied up in a certain way. And so Rodgers and Hammerstein just let it happen. They got more involved in South Pacific with mixed effects about the color filters. And Hammerstein was dead by the time of The Sound of Music. But interestingly, one of the last letters Hammerstein wrote in his life to Rodgers revolved around the casting of the movie of The Sound of Music. And when Mary Martin was in the play on Broadway, she was turning 46 years old and playing an 18-year-old postulant. So Hammerstein said, I know we're not going to make this movie for a while, but I think we should resist very strongly having anything other than a totally young, totally fresh-faced person play Maria. He said, I know Doris Day would seem hot right now. She might be too old by the time it comes time to... So Julie Andrews was turning 28 or 29, but I think his point was well taken that, she was much more effective. So Rodgers didn't have much involvement in the making of the film of The Sound of Music either. By then he was in sort of increasingly ill health and drinking a lot. But one of the things that I say in the book that I think helped hurt their reputations is that the films were seen by so many millions of people around the world, and by and large are not as good as the plays. I just don't think by and large they are. So I think a lot of people of a certain age and a certain generation of theater professionals thought of Rodgers and Hammerstein as middle-brow, stodgy, second-rate, dinner theater type of subject. And it's these revivals over the past 15 years and more that have made people see the enormous power and revolutionary spirit that these plays still have.
Hi. Given the Rodgers' attraction to the aesthetic of the 19th century and the show's collective attraction for opera singers from Ezio Pinza all the way down to most recently Renee Fleming in the revival, do you see these pieces as somehow bridging the gap for audiences between opera and musical theater?
Do I see Rodgers and Hammerstein as bridging the gap between opera and musical theater? Yeah, I think in a fundamental way they did. Most people seem to think, Don, you'd know more about this than I do, but don't people think that jazz and musical theater are two of America's truly original art forms? And of course, musical theater as perfected by Rodgers and Hammerstein sort of rejected the European operetta tradition in favor of a more realistic. But I think Carousel has surely been performed in opera houses, and its score is it's almost operatic in ambition. There's a scene where Julie and Billy are falling in love, the so-called bench scene, and large parts of it are sung dialogue, which in opera would be called recitative. Rodgers once said, "What Kurt Weill calls recitative, I call melody." And yeah, I think they are kind of a bridge between those two genres, and certainly, I guess this would be the main thing. In the seriousness of their subject matter, I mean, the plot of South Pacific, or the plot of Carousel particularly, even The King and I, anytime anybody dies at the end, it's probably more likely to be an opera than a comedy, you know, so. Only after they sing a long song, though.
I was wondering how you would compare the musicals of today with those of Rodgers and Hammerstein and this golden age of the American musical.
Well, of course, that's a good question, how to compare the musicals of today with Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rock changed everything, so the idiom is different. Starting in the 60s particularly, and all through the 70s and on, there was the rise of what's called the concept musical, in which character and plot are subordinate to style and sizzle and a kind of non-linear way of storytelling. Company by Sondheim isn't really a narrative story. It doesn't have a beginning and a middle and end. It's a series of vignettes. Cats is Chorus Line is a series of autobiographical snippets about the lives of performers. So I think the theater today, musical theater, is quite different. But I think even the people who rejected the template of the well-made play that Rodgers and Hammerstein sort of perfected, they're all standing on Rodgers and Hammerstein's shoulders, in the sense that whatever the subject matter they may take a stab at, I think the common thread is that people today grapple with serious subject matter, serious themes. Hadestown is a revision of, you know, of myth that wouldn't have been likely before Rodgers and Hammerstein. So I think their influence. Agnes DeMille, when Oscar Hammerstein died, wrote his widow a beautiful letter saying, "Children in years to come will talk with his words and not know where they come from. They'll be in the air they breathe." And I think Rodgers and Hammerstein are in the air we breathe, and that's one of the reasons they've been taken for granted. They're just in the air we breathe.
Thank you for your great talk and even better book. I enjoyed it very much. I have a quick question, but before that, my favorite Rodgers line in an interview he gave, when he was asked by the interviewer, he said, "You know, Mr. Rodgers, you've worked with two of the greatest, you know, lyricists of the 20th century, being Larry Hart and Oscar Hammerstein II. What was the difference working with them?" Rodgers thought for a minute and he said, "Well, you know, when I worked with Larry Hart and he and I would be walking down the street, people would look up and say, 'Well, there goes that little guy and that son of a bitch.' When I was working with Oscar Hammerstein and walking down the street, people would look up and say, 'Oh, there goes that big guy and that son of a bitch.'"
I think he is supposed to have said something like that, that when Hart was tiny, Hart was under 5 feet tall, and Rodgers was 5'9" or something like that. It is true that Rodgers had the reputation of being sort of a difficult SOB, and Hammerstein was corny as Kansas in August. But there's plenty of evidence that Hammerstein was every bit as sharp-dealing a businessman, every bit as prickly a person when he wanted to be as Rodgers. But yes, Rodgers definitely was the bad cop in the relationship, and he took the brunt of the blame for that.
Didn't Rodgers describe the difference between Hart and Hammerstein as Larry cares about the how, Oscar cares about the what?
Yeah, he said in writing the lyrics that Hart loved the wordplay, how you got to express yourself. Oscar cared about what you were trying to say.
And could you comment too about, you know, in Hammerstein working with both Jerome Kern earlier on and then Richard Rodgers, they had to be two of the best examples of writing waltz.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you think that had an influence on the way that Hammerstein could seamlessly work with both of them?
I think, interestingly, when Rodgers was a young man, his god was Jerome Kern. He idolized Jerome Kern, who was classically trained composer, studied in Europe. You know, in some ways his songs could be by Schubert or one of the other, by Brahms or any other romantic composer. And I'm sure that Rodgers hoped that he could be considered to be an heir of Kern's, and I think that Hammerstein had a very congenial working relationship with Kern. It's interesting because Rodgers is on record as talking about what he had to do in writing The King and I, for example, in creating an Eastern Asian Oriental sound while writing in a Western American musical idiom. He said it was as if Grant Wood were painting a picture of Thailand it would look like Thailand but be distinctly American at the same time. And I think it's a little bit the same thing, that they knew that they had to. Both Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein could hardly have been anything other than American, but they both owed a great debt to the traditions of the European Romantic composers.
Thank you. And finally, when someone asked Rodgers, well, what comes first, the lyrics or the music? Rodgers looked at him and he said, the check.
Well, there's a great story about that. The Hollywood songwriter Sammy Cahn is supposed to have been asked that same question, which comes first, the words or the music, and Sammy said the phone call. But in one case or another, I think we're lucky that they got the phone call.
Well, I'd like to thank Todd Purdum, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm really a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank
Great.
you. Thank you. I'm really, really appreciative. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Joe.